Hey everyone, because the research for my videos and responses tends to take a while to put together, and the fact that I've got a full-time job and I'm going to college full-time, I thought I'd do something different on the alternate weeks I'm not releasing pro-transgender content. Of course, if you like this sort of stuff, please like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you get notified when I release more content. Now, on to the rest of the video. This week, I'm replying to this guy, Troll Despiser, who has some questions for atheists. This video is essentially one long 5-minute run-on sentence, so some of the cuts are going to be in awkward places. I tried to avoid that as much as possible, but he made replying to this video rather difficult.
Yeah, I thought of something else.
Did I miss something? I feel like I've stepped into the middle of a conversation here. I went through the videos preceding this one and none of them followed any coherent path, so I'm just going to assume you thought of something off the cuff and decided to make a video about it.
I want to know what the point is of atheists going after Christians. Why do you go after us? Why do you want to disprove God? Why do you want to disprove the Bible?
I don't go after Christians. I'm not hunting Christians down with an elephant gun and bagging them for the old trophy wall. I don't go out of my way to tell Christians that I don't believe in their God or that I don't think their arguments are valid. What I tend to do when I'm not taking a break from my transgender research is argue against anti-LGBTQ rhetoric that, unfortunately, means arguing against a lot of theists, mostly on the grounds of God said X or the Bible says Y. So part of my counter-argument naturally must encompass arguments against the existence of a god or gods and logical arguments against statements made in the Bible. That being said, I can understand why some atheists would go after Christians, especially the evangelical crowd that also happens to be home to some of the more vocal young earth creationists and biblical literalists in the country. They try to do things like cram creationism into science classes in an end-around attempt to teach the Bible in classrooms as something more than just part of the philosophy of theology. These are also the same group of people that try to reframe the American Bill of Rights and the Constitution in such a way as to redefine our country as a Christian theocracy. Of course, there are other Christians that just like to insert their God wherever they see fit, such as when science can't fully explain abiogenesis to a high enough confidence interval to satisfy everyone, or the question of what happened before the Big Bang. They take science's admissions of "we don't know" to mean God did it, and use that as some sort of excuse to either promote their sect of Christianity or promote the idea of teaching God as science. For those conversations, I say going after Christians is a valid thing to do. Stopping the spread of misinformation and trying to encourage people to use rationality and logic is a noble goal, and one absolutely worth pursuing. On the other hand, people who just attack Christians for posting about believing in God or who just talk about verses in the Bible doesn't make much sense to me. If someone wants to believe something or even just discuss their belief, that's fine. When I take issue is when somebody wants the idea of God to be the be-all, end-all of scientific knowledge.
And you make up stuff like God annihilates innocent people without warning, which is not true, because I could read it to you out of the Bible, but you would still discount it. It's not in there.
Okay, I don't really care. To me, it's just a book full of stories and fables. Heck, as a book, the Bible's form of literature is inconsistent. It starts off as a mythological story, but then transitions to a more historical narrative somewhere around halfway through the Old Testament that becomes some kind of weird pseudo-biographical account of the life and times of Jesus, followed by some end-of-the-world fan fiction. As a literary work, none of it flows very well. It has extremely odd editing decisions, there are some stories that are repeated with contradictions, and the overall voice of the book is, well, inconsistent. Which is to be expected because it's not a book, at least not in the modern sense. It's a collection of ancient written manuscripts that were created over the span of many generations of people. I'm pretty sure most of it was oral tradition before someone had the good sense to write this stuff down. So I don't really care about the arguments against God, at least not from a literal reading of the Bible. There's too much inconsistency for me to really care about God as depicted in the Bible.
Why go through all this work to tell Christians that we're stupid and we're believing in a magical, stupid beast in the sky that's angry and kills people, innocent people for no reason, which isn't true? What's the point in doing that?
I imagine if you're at the point where someone is rebuking you with the typical Sky Daddy argument, that your own side of the argument would involve claims of a tri-omni God, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. If that's the case, then pointing out things such as God literally genocides the entire planet with Noah's flood is a valid argument against such a being, as wiping out people that never had the chance to hear about his existence is evil. For example, the people living on Hawaii or in Australia at the time of the supposed flood would have never had the opportunity to know about the God of Israel, but according to the story of Noah, they too would have been killed in the flood. As for calling people stupid, I've seen that at least in YouTube comments, but I've never really agreed with it. I don't think people are stupid for believing in something per se, but I think their logic, reasoning, and argumentation as to why they believe could be described as uneducated.
My point to talk to people is to tell them how wonderful God is and how wonderful my life has changed since I accepted Christ as my Savior. What is your point? So I answered the question for you guys on your side. What is your point? Why do that? Why make up stuff about the Bible and pick little pieces out?
Well, I've sort of answered that already. My point in refuting Christian claims mostly stems from my LGBTQ plus activism and specifically my pro-transgender activism. My argumentation often butts up against people who will use the Bible extensively to justify their bigoted garbage, and so being able to refute the Bible goes a long way to refuting their arguments. As for why we pick little pieces out of the Bible and focus on them, that's because those little pieces of the Bible tend to be rather large parts of Christian theology and claims made by Christians in support of their belief. For example, one of the major arguments I often come across is that I am, quote, made in the image of God, unquote, and therefore, since I am made in his image, being transgender is an intentional, hateful act of rebellion against God's will. Well, here's the problem. Imago Dei is a pretty weird concept that, as far as we know, may not be translated into our cultural understanding accurately. Does Imago Dei mean that men and women are made in the image of God because God is both man and woman? Or does it mean that the whole of humanity is representative of God's image, and so the entirety of the human experience is what comprises God? Better still, are there some other options out there that really define what Imago Dei means? After all, we're working from ancient Greek translations of older documents that we currently don't have access to. What did those documents say exactly? Did the ancient translators translate them perfectly without interpretational errors or cultural biases? In addition, that ancient Greek has been translated and reinterpreted literally hundreds of times in multiple languages, with multiple intentions, some not so honorable, and the language we've translated into recently, English, didn't even exist back when the ancient Greeks translated their version of documents. Old English itself is estimated to have started to be spoken around the 5th century, almost 500 years after the earliest known manuscripts of the New Testament. And my point being that we pick little pieces out of the Bible because those little things that we point out have enormous consequences. If there's uncertainty in the meaning of words in one part of the Bible, then the entire theological underpinnings of modern Christianity are called into question.
It would be like this. Humor me for a moment.
This is going to take much longer than a moment, isn't it?
You go into an auto shop, and there's a car sitting there. And you say to that auto mechanic, I believe that car is a gutless wonder. That thing, I wouldn't be surprised if it has anything over 75 horsepower. And he says, what? This is a 427 Hemi. It puts 425 out at the wheel. Naturally aspirated engine. No turbos, nothing. Right to the tire, 425 on the pavement. And you go, no, that's 75 horsepower at the most. I think it's probably more like 65 horsepower. What do you think that mechanic's going to do if he hears that? He's going to walk outside and go, I just put it on the dyno in front of him. It showed 425 horsepower. What's wrong with this guy? He's going to defend that horsepower of that car. That's what I do with the Bible.
Okay, well, long-winded story aside, that's not what you do with the Bible. In fact, this is the exact opposite of what theists do. For your story to be true, the atheist would be telling you to prove the Bible is true, and then you prove the truth of the Bible. But that's not what's happening. In your story, the mechanic actively demonstrates the efficacy of the car. He takes the car to the dyno and measures the output and calculated horsepower. That's not what theists do with the Bible. To accurately represent what you do with the Bible, the mechanic, when asked to prove the horsepower of the engine, would have turned to the specification sheet for the engine and said, "It says here 425 horsepower." There would be no empirically demonstrated proof. And that's what you're doing. Atheists are asking you to prove your claims, and instead of offering any empirical proof showing the efficacy of the Bible, you simply point to verses in the Bible to prove the truth of it. You are using the Bible as evidence of the claim, but the claim is in the Bible. You cannot demonstrate the truth of the Bible by pointing to the Bible and saying it's true because the Bible says it's true. That's a fallacy and is logically incoherent. Now that I think about it, your story is exactly what young Earth creationists do. They claim the Earth is only 6,000 years old. We show them actual scientific evidence that it's not, but then they disregard the empirical proof and continue to claim the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
He's out there spreading around and it only has 75 horsepower. Now the other mechanics are sticking their head out there. It's an industrial part of town. They're like, what is the car? Oh, it's got a 427 in it. Naturally aspirated 427. It puts almost the same amount of horsepower out per cubic inches. 1 per cubic inch. 425 horsepower. Now, I don't know exactly. I mean, you'd have to Google it and see how much. Well, Google's fake, right? Of course, but
Google's fake? I can't tell if you're saying this is some kind of conspiracy theory slighting Google or mocking people who have told you Google's fake. I don't really know where this is coming from. Who are you talking to that says Google's fake? I mean, inaccurate, sure. Google will return results you're more likely to click on based on your internet activity so they can get more money from ad revenue. Sometimes that might result in you getting factually inaccurate links that will support your presupposition, which is why you shouldn't trust Google as your only research tool. You shouldn't trust any single source, to be perfectly honest, but in your example, if I were to search Google to try and figure out how to convert naturally aspirated horsepower to output per cubic inches, I'd basically trust the results I get because that's all mathematical formula, and nobody's really going to run around trying to redefine conversion formulas like that. I mean, conspiracy theorists just don't do boring mathematical work like that. They like to fantasize about bigger, larger things like the government hiding aliens or waterfalls not being real. Stuff like that. So if you're searching for the factual accuracy of things, such as exactly what the Bible and its different translations say, sure, I'd trust Google for that. But if you're searching for what the Bible means, then I wouldn't trust my own Google results, let alone yours. My results will be filled to the brim with atheist sources debunking apologetics, while yours would likely be filled with Christian sources that reinforce your sect of Christianity's message. That's why I don't rely on Google to tell me ambiguous things that need to be interpreted. I like to rely on scholarly articles and debates rather than a tool like Google or even ChatGPT. I gravitate towards scholars like Dan McClellan, who not only write some pretty robust scholarly articles, but also speak about these topics at a more understandable level for the layman. But again, you have to be careful with stuff like that. Dan is a Mormon, and so I have to take into account his bias towards his faith when discussing this stuff. Likewise, there are tons of biblical scholars that have taken an oath of faith and decided that their research will only reflect what their faith says. They've essentially capitulated to dogma, which I find to be a brutally dishonest way of doing scholarly work. Anyway, long rant over. Google's not fake. The search results are tailored to get you to click on links and generate revenue.
Find out, call a mechanic's office or shop, or call a car enthusiast and ask them how much a 427 Hemi has. But it's a lot of horsepower. It wouldn't be 75. The mechanics can be like, what in the world's wrong with you? What do you keep telling people it has 75 horsepower? That's not true. And you're spreading it around, telling everybody it's got 75 horsepower. And the proof in the pudding is it has 425. You saw it.
Does this analogy ever end? I get it, man. You're falsely equivocating the mechanic with Bible-thumping theists and the a-horsepowerist with atheists. Let's move on already.
People saw Jesus healing people. They saw him raising people from the dead, and they still didn't believe it. How much evidence do you need? There's my second question. How much evidence do you need? People who saw it with their own eyes denied it. They denied it when they looked at it.
So you're either talking about Paul's claim in his letter to the Corinthians that 500 people witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, or you're talking about Thomas, who doubted Jesus' resurrection and demanded to touch the holes in his hand. I don't know. You could be talking about something else, but let's just assume you're talking about those stories. Neither one of those stories is proof of the resurrection of Jesus. They are both claims of events that supposedly happened, but they're not, in and of themselves, evidence of such an event. Saying 500 people saw the resurrection of Jesus just means that we now have to prove that not only did this event occur, but that 500 people actually witnessed this happen. And here's the crux of the problem. We can't find any other sources outside of the Bible that corroborate this story. I mean, you'd think some Roman soldier at some point would have written a letter back home. Dear wife, I'm still in the army and not dead yet. My sandals hurt. The desert sucks. I saw this Jesus guy resurrect and this guy named Thomas fingered his handholes. Send my regards to Dad. Speaking of Thomas, the only place we see the story of Thomas fingering Jesus' handholes is in the Gospel of John, which has its own set of problems. I mean, the Gospel of John is written like a fan retelling of the original Jesus narrative, where the main character is made more perfect, new original content is added, some plot holes are tidied up, the timeline is shifted around a bit, and some contradictions are explained away. To put it another way, the Gospel of John is written like how a Dragon Ball fan would rewrite the rules for a resurrection, such that death actually mattered somewhere in the story. Now, when you look at the Bible from the perspective of the social sciences, and specifically through the historical lens, the biblical narrative falls apart. There is no outside proof of much of anything in the Bible. Yes, the Bible mentions historical places that were known to exist, but it also mentions things that historical scholars say just never happened and could have never happened, like the census of Quirinius that required Joseph to return to his ancestral home to be accounted for. Except that story doesn't make any sense, and that's the problem with oral tradition and eyewitness testimony. The Gospel of Luke, which is what contained the story of the census of Quirinius, was estimated to have been written around 80 to 90 CE. That's at least 50 years after the death of Jesus. Any eyewitness testimony from around that time would have gone through 50 years of telling and retelling, misremembering, and piecing together, which results in the story of the census of Quirinius. There is no possible way for Quirinius to have called for such a census because Herod, who is cited in the story, died in 4 BCE, while Quirinius wasn't appointed governor of Syria until 6 CE. There's a decade-long gap between the two. There are other problems too, such as Rome would have never called for Joseph to return to his ancestral home, or even cared about Mary since women weren't counted in Roman census at the time. So you're using the Bible as proof that something happened, but there's nothing outside of the Bible that says these events happened, and the Bible is, at best, extremely inaccurate. All of this to say that you cannot say the Bible is the equivalent of empirically proving a claim.
If you saw somebody raise somebody from the dead, you would say, as an atheist, well, they weren't really dead. They were in a deep sleep. They had a very slow pulse, and it wasn't palpable, and yeah, he wasn't really dead.
This is assuming that I accept the events of the Bible happened as described, and I think I've made it very clear that I do not take the words of the Bible at face value. However, if I did see someone raised from the dead, I would have a lot more questions than answers, and I can guarantee you that the last possible answer in my mind would be God did it. The biggest question on my mind would be, what even is death? How do we define death? The more advanced we become in medical science, the further back we can push the barrier of death. We used to think that heart failure was death. Then, thanks to a combination of some pretty crazy drugs and procedures, we were able to restart fully stopped hearts. We used to think that zero brainwave activity was death, but we've been able to resuscitate people who have had no discernible brain activity. Of course, there are limits to that, but the more we understand about our bodies, the more we are forced to ask the question, when is someone actually dead? So when I see someone raised from the dead, I wouldn't just ask the question, were they dead? I would ask, under what conditions were they declared to be dead? Was this someone that simply passed out from heat stroke? Was he in a vegetative state? You can't just make the claim that someone was raised from the dead. I need a lot more information before I can accept that claim.
Well, how did he tell them to stand up and they stood up suddenly? How did he bring up their blood pressure enough that they could stand up? They couldn't stand up before. So I could refute that with evidence and fact, and he'd still deny it.
But that's not what's happening. There is no evidence of fact being presented. You're just reiterating a story that was recorded decades after the alleged act happened. That's all. That's not evidence. That's a claim. I don't know how else to explain this to you. Through the lens of history, evidence would be corroboration. We would have multiple eyewitness accounts of these resurrection events, and they wouldn't greatly conflict and contradict each other. Sure, as eyewitness accounts, they wouldn't be particularly accurate on their own, but the more eyewitness accounts of these events outside of the claims of the Bible, the better. All I'm asking for is just a source, one other person who wrote a plain, everyday letter that was documenting what happened in their lives, and they said that, you wouldn't believe what happened. I woke up today, fed the dog, went outside, and I saw Jesus of Nazareth resurrect the dead simply by commanding them to wake up. Then I took a poop. Not some letter to some Corinthians that does nothing but evangelize. That would be the corroborating evidence that backs up the claim made in the Bible. But we don't have that. What we have are contradicting stories and more miraculous acts as the retelling of the Jesus narrative evolves over the decades. In fact, the further back we rewind the clock on the Gospels, going back from John back in time to Mark, Jesus becomes far less divine and performs far less miraculous feats. Therefore, one could not be faulted for inferring that Jesus was just some ordinary guy that said a lot of things that really resonated with people at the time. All I'm discussing here is historical evidence. The only reason I point out historical evidence is because I think empirical evidence would be impossible to produce. Raising people from the dead appears to be a strictly Jesus thing in the Bible, a supernatural phenomenon that modern science would be unable to reproduce. Of course, you'd still have to define what dead is, and then you'd have to eliminate natural resuscitation means as even plausible, but that's a little bit out of our scope here.
That first question that I want you to answer is, what's the purpose in telling lies about the Bible to discount God? And then the second question, which I just asked.
Oh, so you weren't asking questions this whole time. You were just rambling some incoherent thoughts. Okay. So your questions are, what's the purpose in telling lies about the Bible to discount God? And if an atheist saw someone raised from the dead, how could you possibly discount Jesus commanding them to wake up? I think that's what your second question is supposed to be. You know, it would have been a lot better if you just asked these questions instead of making a long, rambling analogy about a car engine.
Answer those two questions, please. And none of this other riffraff, none of this other stuff, this mantra that you guys have, the mantra of annihilating innocent people without warning. And I want to talk about Noah's Ark, and I want to talk about Abraham and Isaac, and don't bring up any of that crap. Stay on topic, stay on this video. Thank you.
Well, if the problem you have in discussions with atheists is that they bring up the story of Noah's flood, then I think you likely evangelize for a tri-omni God, and in that context, complaining about the actions of God in the story of Noah makes perfect sense to counter your belief system. If you are evangelizing for a tri-omni God, then you should have asked atheists for proof of why we think God isn't omniscient, omnipotent, or omnibenevolent. That would have made for a far more interesting discussion. As it stands, though, you've asked a couple of rhetorical questions that you likely don't really want answered. You probably just want to feel better about yourself and your beliefs. Whatever. This response video was likely a waste of time since you're probably just going to dismiss it like you've dismissed everyone else that tries to give you some valid argumentation. At least I had fun making the logical response. For those of you that subscribe to me for my transgender content, that'll be in my next video. I'm trying to make more regular content that doesn't require such a huge amount of research so that I can keep a weekly schedule. Things like this are just kind of fun for the logical argumentation exercise. Thanks for watching, and again, please like, comment, and subscribe.